You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 468 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, Will Porter returns. He has some news that he's written at RT over the past week, and he's going to talk about those articles and do a coronavirus update and a few other things on the show today. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be back. How you doing, Kyle?
Doing well. We got our, this Monday schedule going on. That's been great. So I've had you on every week to mostly talk about what you're writing about over at RT as a staff writer, but also to talk about some other foreign policy and world events we've been following. For those of you who are maybe brand new to the show and somehow don't know who Will Porter is, me and Will have written some articles together that are published over at the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where you'll find this show to share it. And he's also written at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Daily Sheeple. So, Will, on today's agenda, we have Tulsi Gabbard dropping out of the race and essentially endorsing Biden. Well, I guess she pretty much kind of cleared up on the Jimmy Dore show that she did endorse Joe Biden as, she said support and endorse is essentially the same thing.
Right. Yeah. So I think this is like probably the worst way she could have exited the 2020 presidential race, by showing support for Joe Biden. For someone who just spent all this time railing against the rot of the Democratic establishment, I think that was a word she actually used herself. And, Joe Biden is sort of a figurehead of that very Democratic establishment. So for her to turn around and throw her support behind this guy, like, it's just kind of incredible. Like, Joe Biden, really? Like, this, I don't know. He's certainly not in line with like any of the principles she's been talking about throughout her campaign. I would sort of expect that kind of thing from someone like Bernie Sanders, who like in 2016 kind of crawled on his belly and endorsed Hillary Clinton even after her and the DNC had just like totally stacked the deck against him. But I didn't really expect it from Tulsi, to be honest. She's not perfect, but like up until now, she has shown like a pretty good amount of integrity, I think, like on the impeachment vote, for example, like she showed that she would not just fall in line with like the tide or the way the wind was blowing in the party. She like voted along with what she thought was right, or at least it seemed that way to me. But so that does not seem like what she did with, her dropping out of the race and endorsing Biden. And I have gotten some pushback from some people like, about me being so critical of her supporting Biden. Some saying that like, endorsing Bernie Sanders would have been pointless because, he can't win at this point. But like, I just asked, why does she have to endorse anybody? Why? Like, there's no requirement that you have to endorse someone once you drop out. She could have dropped out, made a nice exit statement, and then left it at that. And not to mention, Bernie Sanders, I don't think really deserved her endorsement anyway. She stuck her neck out for him in 2016 and backed him. And I think she's even defended him a couple times in the current race from some of the more like ridiculous attacks that he was facing. But like, as far as I can tell, he's been nowhere to be seen, when nowhere to be found when she's being called a traitor or the candidate of a foreign power or whatever. And so, I don't think she should have necessarily endorsed Bernie Sanders. But that's not the only other option. She could have like, been like Ron Paul and not endorsed anyone. She didn't have to do that. And I also just find this like mentality weird that like, you're expected to endorse the candidate who you already think is going to win. I just feel like at that point, like, what's even the purpose, like just to say that you picked a winner, like it's a horse race or something. It's not like they give you a cash prize, though, in this case, like a horse race would be. It just seems kind of like a futile exercise you have to back the guy who you already think is going to win. And sort of given how the average Democrat seems to not like Tulsi Gabbard, at least, from what I've seen. And a lot of that, of course, is based on nonsense, like she's some kind of Assad lover, that she loves the Syrian government, or she's a toady. But because of that, because she doesn't have that much influence within the Democratic Party, this support for Biden is not going to have much tangible effect on the race. Like, I don't think Tulsi's supporters are about to jump right over to Biden from Tulsi. Like, that just doesn't seem like it's in the cards to me. And from what I've seen online, there's been a pretty strong reaction to this, like a feeling of like resentment and betrayal over this, this move. And ultimately, I kind of think this is just like a careerist thing. Like, I think she's trying to salvage some kind of future, some kind of career in the Democratic Party under its current leadership. It's going to lose her a lot of her diehard supporters who like her precisely because she's not afraid to criticize people like Joe Biden. But it might allow her to sort of remain in the party for a little bit longer, because it kind of pleases the elites and the leadership and the establishment. And so, like, I don't know. I just think this was kind of a shameful move. Like, I know Tulsi is not perfect. I was never a massive, like, diehard supporter of hers, but she was by far the best person on foreign policy out of any of the Democrats running, except maybe like Gravel, but he was never on a debate stage. He was always a very low level candidate. But, I just think this is a really poor way for her to close out her campaign.
100% agree, Will, on the disappointment. I guess, if she would have dropped out and said, I have, an obligation with the National Guard, which is, part of the point that she made, and likely be called up for the coronavirus and not endorse Biden, I think that would have, been just fine. I don't think anybody would have been heckling her for an endorsement because the Democratic establishment doesn't like Tulsi anyways. And so it just, I guess, didn't make sense to me that she would feel the need to endorse Biden right away like that. I could see her not endorsing Bernie, like you said, as Bernie did stand up for it. And I think that's a really good point to make. One interesting thing I did notice, Will, was Amy Klobuchar, after Tulsi endorses Biden, suddenly is interested in praising Tulsi Gabbard. So when she's, an active major in the Hawaii National Guard and Hillary Clinton calls her a traitor, that, nobody stands up. And then the minute she endorses Joe Biden, suddenly she's acceptable.
Yeah, I saw quite a few, sort of more establishment or centrist leaning Democratic figures coming out and like applauding Tulsi, like, wow, this is a really good, showing, a really good way to end your campaign, Tulsi. But, of course, that's so like, it's very opportunist, very convenient that now they're okay with her. But yeah, they totally would never, they would never even dream of defending her or praising her prior to that.
And and the reason Tulsi's candidacy was important was because of the anti-war message. And again, had Joe Biden gotten the nomination and then she said, well, as a Democratic representative, I bat the nominee or whatever, like that, it is understandable. I don't think that's necessarily a huge sellout of her value. But doing it this way, I do think isn't. It did sell out the anti-war message. I will mention that Tulsi is pretty clearly not anti-war either. She does have a, end the regime change wars narrative, but she even clarified on Jimmy Dore's show when he was interviewing her after she dropped out about her dedication to fighting, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS-like group overseas. And while that, some people may say, well, they do hate Americans, that may be true, but, the wars just end up creating more of them. And also look at what happens like against the fight against ISIS. There's a pretty good article by Matthew Pate in Reason right now. Basically, and he uses this phrase, how they went from fighting the Islamic State to the Islamic Republic.
Right. Yeah. And Tulsi, like, she's always just been relatively better. She's never been like, actually good on this, like in a Ron Paulian kind of way where like you can really get behind it. Like, really, she's just been very vocally attacking some of America's worst foreign policies. And so, like, that even, like, the bar is sort of so low that even that is considered, like, above and beyond everybody else. And we should also not forget, too, like, Tulsi has taken quite a few donations from, like, the arms industries, from some of these, like, some of the usual players, Lockheed Martin and stuff. So, I think she could be criticized on those grounds as well. But, yeah, she's never been super stridently anti-war across the board, just vocally better about certain policies, some of the worst policies. And so,
right,
to that
she
extent,
made her campaign about, ending regime change wars. She didn't make her campaign about killing Al-Qaeda. And so that's the reason that you were able to support her. So
yeah, exactly.
I do want to move on to talking about, why it's so important that Tulsi Gabbard had a voice on this stage, not only to talk about regime change wars, but also kind of this new Cold War we're entering in, nuclear warfare. And I talk a lot about the show, Will, about U.S. nuclear policy and potential, nuclear conflict with Russia. But just to talk about how damaging nuclear weapons are, let's look at a potential and as some people say, probably more likely nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India. These are two countries that don't have massive nuclear triads like the United States and Russia, but do have small nuclear arsenals that can be delivered at least by missile, if not by both missile and bomber. And what kind of worldwide devastation will we see from this type of conflict?
Yeah, so there's a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and they recently published this study put together by researchers at universities across the U.S. and Europe, looking at like the possible consequences of even a small-scale nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. And as you suggested, like a lot of analysts have sort of posited that those two, like if anyone's like who's the most likely to get into a nuclear war, it might actually be those two neighbors, there in South Asia. And currently, I think India has something like 150 nuclear weapons, and Pakistan has a slightly smaller number, but kind of a similar arsenal. Like I think they have like 100. But even combining both of their arsenals, they only have a tiny fraction of like the total number of nuclear weapons worldwide, which is like I think there are like 14,000 weapons worldwide. But even in what this study called a quote unquote limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which they define as being 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs, sort of like 50 from both sides. And which we should also note, like a Hiroshima-sized bomb is much smaller and less powerful than like a modern hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon, which can like destroy an entire city. But even this like what they call a limited nuclear war could potentially impact the entire planet for up to a decade afterward, far beyond their own region there in South Asia. And so I think this is something that Gordon Prather used to talk about a lot. There's a physicist who used to write at antiwar.com a lot. But the major issue here is not with the explosions themselves. It's not with the initial nuclear blast, but it's the fires that burn afterward. Or maybe it's Daniel Ellsberg who talked about the global fires. But this study estimates that the fires ignited by these bombs could send 5 million tons of soot into the atmosphere, which would basically like blot out the sun. Like not completely, it wouldn't leave us totally in darkness, but it would be enough to cause temperatures to drop around the world and the overall climate to change enough to where it starts screwing with agriculture. And so that's like the real the risk here. And so corn is like the most common cereal crop on Earth. It's like a super important staple crop. And this research estimates that corn yields could decline like massively across what are called the breadbasket regions of the Northern Hemisphere. And so we're talking like Europe, the U.S., China, and Russia, for example, major like areas where a lot of food is grown. And so in the U.S., they expect that corn harvest could decline by up to 20%. And then in Russia, they think that they could be cut in half, so by 50%. And then, of course, soybeans and wheat and other like staple crops would also take similar hits like this. But sort of paradoxically, even though that like the food production would be most impacted in the Northern Hemisphere, it's actually these developing countries in the Southern Hemisphere that would feel the worst pain out of this, because they rely on food imports from the North, from these more economically productive and like developed countries. And so within 5 years of this hypothetical nuclear war, the study says that up to 70 poorer countries in the Southern Hemisphere with a combined population of 1.3 billion, so like big chunk of the world's population, could see their food availability drop by 20%. And for the whole world, it would go down by 13%. And so that would constitute the biggest shock to the world food supply that has ever been documented in recent history. It's worse than any of the harshest droughts, and like the amount of soot that would be launched in the atmosphere would exceed any volcanic eruption that we've ever observed, like even the biggest, craziest ones. And so even a relatively small nuclear war, if you can call any nuclear war small, even that has the potential to pretty much devastate the entire planet. You know, like we're talking maybe hundreds of millions of people could die from this. And that's far from the number of people who would just be vaporized in the initial explosion. Like that's not even the major problem. It's all the cascading effects on the climate and on the the agricultural systems in various countries that could really, that's the real problem. And so, I think your listeners could go check out the study themselves. There's a lot more it gets into more of like the quantities and the numbers and stuff and shows you like how they come to these conclusions. But those are sort of its main points, that like the soot, the fires would launch soot into the atmosphere, which would drop temperatures and, alter the climate so much that it causes severe disruptions in food production. And so that's really like a major risk we're looking at here from even a small scale nuclear war.
Right. And, that's why ideas and movements like Global Zero and anything to try to eliminate nuclear weapons is really important. And I know, from a libertarian, it does seem like a left-wing hippie kind of position to get rid of nukes, and maybe it's not, reasonable to get rid of every last one, in our current lifetime or time frame. The idea that we could, start to, shrink nuclear arsenals and stuff like that is very important, especially if, getting rid of 100 U.S. nukes and 100 Russian nukes means Pakistan or India is also willing to drop their nuclear arsenal, even by a few, make it less likely to use, and hopefully, minimize any potential damage done if anybody is ever insane enough to fire off one of these weapons again. So, this is just very important information, Will, and I really appreciate that you're taking the time to cover it, even though in the middle of this, coronavirus hysteria, there's not a whole lot of time for studies about nuclear, hypothetical nuclear war between Russia and our India and Pakistan.
Yeah, it might be good to take a break from the whole global pandemic thing to consider some, nuclear winter stuff.
Otherwise, the population could be wiped out.
Yeah.
Why we're on our in our doomsday mindset.
Right.
I do want to move on. Well, I guess only a little bit from our doomsday mindset to talk about a Lockheed Martin promo video and kind of the targets that it shows.
Yeah, so this was just kind of funny in the sense that it's like kind of sneaky, the way that Lockheed did this. And so Lockheed Martin, that's the U.S.'s biggest arms dealer, maybe the world's biggest arms dealer, certainly one of them. They put out this fancy new promo video, like kind of showing off some of their new gear. It's all just like CGI cartoons. It's not actual footage of their stuff in action, but they're trying to demonstrate some of their new gear, like a new surveillance drone they're showing off, and also some kind of cruise missile, it looks like. But like 2/3 into this video, if you're watching closely, they're simulating the U.S. bombing enemy forces. It's clearly Russia that's playing the bad guy. Like you can just see like in the CGI, like even though it is just CGI graphics and the narrator in the video doesn't mention anything about Russia by name, you can very clearly see there are S-400 missile defense systems there, and then which those have a fairly distinctive shape. And there's also a Topol M, which is a Russian ICBM platform, like a nuclear platform. And Russia does not export those to other countries like they do with some of their missile defense systems. And so this is a pretty clear giveaway that like Lockheed is putting Russia in the crosshairs in this simulation. So we basically have them simulating what looks like some kind of preemptive strike on Russia. And so, of course, Lockheed Martin, they stand to gain a lot by hyping up conflict with the Russians, or at least with the idea that Russia is some huge threat that has to be countered. It helps them sell their overpriced aircraft like the F-35, which we've talked about, I'm sure, on the show plenty of times. But, that aircraft has had endless problems and delays and cost overruns. And so they need some help selling that for sure. And it could also be noted, too, that like Lockheed's stock price has gone up by like 70% between the election of Donald Trump and just recently, because there've been pretty severe crashes in the stock market with this whole virus thing. But like in the period when anti-Russian rhetoric was like hitting a fever pitch in the United States with all the election stuff, Lockheed's stock value was soaring. So it went up by 70%. And then also, of course, Trump's national security strategy, which is involved like shifting focus from terrorism in the Middle East to what they call great power competition. That has sort of also helped Lockheed ink some of these pretty gigantic contracts from the Pentagon. And so it seems pretty clear to me that hyping up conflict with the Russians is just part of Lockheed's like marketing strategy. We can see it kind of paying off for them in various ways. And I think that's pretty clearly on display here in this promo video.
Yeah, and this is something that I believe happened when the Russians announced their new hypersonic missile, nuclear capable missiles. Yeah. They had those missiles hitting somewhere around Trump's resort at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And so, but at the same time, it does just kind of, I think it's telling on, just as to what Lockheed Martin is and what they promote and where they make their money. And that's by hyping up a conflict between the United States and Russia. And, in one sense, I guess maybe they could justify it as a jobs program, because with the number of nuclear weapons that the U.S. and Russia both has, and as Will just explained, how even limited nuclear exchange would, cause so many problems for the planet, you can't really imagine that many humans, if any, really surviving a major nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. That I don't know. I guess that's just the crazy position that we're in.
Yeah. I mean, like, certainly, like, I think I would certainly hope that the costs of a nuclear war would be too high to where it is just sort of, like you said, like a jobs program where, this is just like, this is sort of for play or for show or something. And they're not really, trying to get us into a war. But it's not always clear that, some people in the, military planners and people in some of the leadership, it's not always clear that they do consider this, just for show, that they might be willing to really, like, take us to the brink here, playing brinkmanship. Like we saw a lot of that during the Cold War, but, I think we still have a lot of people in leadership who are still very willing to take us right to the edge like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I think is a very good transition to talking about Iran, where in one sense it seems, at the same time like a joke that the United States really can't go to war with Iran. And, as we'll talk about in this episode, the Pentagon's even really not for it. They don't want to fight a war there. And yet we seem to be inching closer and closer in that direction. So, Will, do you want to give us some updates on recent events of U.S. tensions and escalating and kind of what's going on behind the scenes with the U.S. and Iran?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about like the situation in Iraq lately, and how every single time a rocket gets launched somewhere, they immediately pin it on the Iranians, saying that Iran somehow puppeteered some Iraqi militia into shooting the rocket. And sort of regardless of where the evidence leads, and often without even citing any evidence at all, they put it on Iran. And so in the last few weeks, there have been a few such rocket attacks like this, one of which actually killed 2 U.S. soldiers and a British medic. And that prompted the U.S. to launch, retaliation strikes against this Iraqi militia, who they say that Iran basically put them up to this. And those strikes, of course, only ended up killing regular Iraqi soldiers and not actual militiamen. But nonetheless, even despite those retaliation strikes that we've already done, Trump's national security team has been pushing for a direct response against Iran, like a direct strike on, Iranian soil. And that's especially been like the civilians at the State Department, the Secretary of State, and the Iran envoy, Brian Hook. That's been the Director of National Intelligence, Richard Grenell, and the National Security Advisor as well, Robert O'Brien. And sort of as you suggested, these guys have been pushing this even more than the actual military, even more than the defense secretary or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that's kind of an interesting thing, how this is broken down. Who's pushing for what here? The actual guys who would be doing the fighting are sort of not as down for it. But in a really surprising story, you actually brought this one to my attention. According to NBC, Trump himself has shot down the idea of an attack on Iran. And he's saying that it would make us look bad, seeing that as Iran is smack in the middle of like a major health crisis right now with the virus. Iran is like by far the hardest hit country in the Middle East by the coronavirus. And so that I found just surprising that Trump is like, he's siding with the military. It sounds weird to say. He's siding with the military in restraint here against the wild-eyed mad bomber civilian officials. But we should, I guess, remember this isn't the first time that he's called for some restraint against the Iranians in a sort of surprising or unexpected way. You'll recall that like 9 months ago, I'm virtually certain we covered this on the show together, when Iran shot down that U.S. spy drone that was flying either just over their territory or just outside of it. Trump had turned down a retaliation strike saying that like, hey, they only shot down a drone. I don't want to kill anyone in response to that. And so that was also kind of a surprising move there. Like you don't usually expect. Trump is often pretty blustery and hawkish, but for him to suddenly adopt this sort of like a little bit of humanity is a little surprising. But we should also keep in mind, though, that the Trump administration did recently, like just last week, they did just slap more sanctions on Iran, and that's adding to this huge mountain of sanctions that already exists on Iran. And so there doesn't seem to be any concern about the coronavirus there, apparently, like even though we're destroying their economy, and that makes it much harder for them to actually fight the virus in various ways, just like, money and resources, you need these things to fight a pandemic. Even if the sanctions aren't hitting some dual use items, which we think and have argued that they are, but even if they're just generally tanking the economy by screwing up their oil sales or something, all of that will still make it harder for them to combat the virus. And so the Trump administration clearly isn't too concerned about it. But it was just interesting to see the president like sort of say, hey, like maybe that would make us look bad. Maybe we should not kick them when they're down like that. I don't know. Trump is he's far from a humanitarian. In many ways, he's a total monster. But like in a few narrow cases, he does still sometimes surprise me with that kind of, with a little bit of humanity that you don't usually see from like the national security state in general.
Right. Well, it is interesting. This is a case where if like the U.S. did carry out some kind of limited airstrike against Iran that didn't lead to a larger war, that's probably going to be less deadly than the sanctions would be. And it is interesting that Trump is probably right in this perception that if he goes ahead and bombs Iran during the middle of the corona outbreak, he'll look like a horrific monster. But if he sanctions them and continues what he calls the maximum pressure campaign and adds to it during that coronavirus, it's not even going to make headline. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Kind of really interesting way people have different outlets on sanctions, which is just economic warfare versus, blowing people apart with bombs.
Right. Yeah. I just I think people ought to see sanctions more as an act of war and not just like some kind of weird pressure move or something. Like it clearly is, like, especially in an instance where it's leading to greater deaths in a country. Like, I don't know, that's some kind of attack. That's some kind of act of war, and people ought to see it that way.
Right. And, I think on an individual level, if Will, you need some kind of medical equipment and somebody is, preventing you from buying it, I don't think anybody's going to argue that you could punch that person in the face. But here, if Iran were to strike out against the U.S. when they're struggling to import necessary medicines in the middle of a coronavirus, everybody would say it's Iranian aggression when in reality it's the American aggression. And that's, one I just really think we're thing to point out right now is that Americans are still aggressors in the, actions between the U.S. and the Iranians. I will say, one concerning part of this story to me is that if the only thing that's keeping Trump from attacking Iran is the coronavirus, and as we've seen in China, the coronavirus apparently does, I don't know, I don't want to say dissipate, but their society isn't currently plagued with that epidemic or pandemic right now. So for the Iranians, let's say in 2 months, coronavirus has more or less either infected and killed everybody that's going to affect and kill, and for the rest of the people, they go back to normal life. And then some group in Iraq, whether it's the League of Revolutionaries, this apparently newly formed Shia group that's pledging to carry out more attacks, could believe Hezbollah or any of the Shia militias in Iraq that have associations with Iran, or the Islamic State or another Sunni group, or just whoever the hell else decides to shell an Iraqi base and hits an American soldier and kills them. Does that mean that Trump is just going to go ahead and press the button and say, go ahead with the attack against Iran?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's super likely we'll see, all attacks against Americans stop. So they're always going to have this window. They're always going to have some opportunity to, as we've seen them doing, any rocket attack, they just immediately pin on Iran-backed militias with no evidence. And so, yeah, that is sort of concerning. If that's the only thing stopping the president is this current health crisis in Iran, I hope for the Iranians' sake that it does end soon. But if that means that they're going to get attacked right after, that's not good.
And certainly, we have seen quite a bit of movement of American soldiers in Iraq, and I think that has been done somewhat in the name or the cover of the coronavirus, but they do seem to be withdrawing from some of the smaller bases, and so maybe there's increasing concern that Americans are going to be targets here. And I think it's just important to emphasize, Will, that the solution here is to leave, not to go with the Pompeo plan of attempted deterrence. And I guess that is again, one thing to highlight that we kind of started off with here, the military, the Esper, Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying no to the diplomats and other security and treasury officials who are pushing for war. But I guess those are the people that do have control of the economic and diplomatic war, and that's maybe one reason why it's going on so much. But Will, do you have anything else to add about this Iran situation and very much playing out in the background of the news of the coronavirus?
Yeah, no, not really. I would just say that. I think that would be the only thing that could compound a global pandemic is also starting a military conflict. So if they could find a way to make it worse, that would be it.
Right. Well, I did see today, just note that the first 2 cases of coronavirus was confirmed in Gaza. And that is one of those places that I've been talking about on the show where if there is an outbreak, and I'm not, an expert on the coronavirus, so if somebody wants to email me and say, what for whatever weather reasons or something in Yemen, we really don't have, or Palestine, we don't, in Gaza, we don't have to worry about an outbreak there, but it's a densely populated area with a population that has received a lot of injuries over the years and a very strained medical system already. So very concerned about a corona outbreak there. But Will, over the few weeks I've had you on the show, one of the things that we've talked about is this growing corona pandemic and kind of the, I guess, hysteria around it. Maybe it's justified, maybe it's not. I continue to think, that we are going a little bit overboard here as a society in our reaction. But, we'll see how this all plays out in the end. And I know you've had your take on the show, so I'll just kind of let you pick up with, wherever you think you need to on this.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just kind of, run down some stuff that happened the last week, some of the major developments and stuff like that. Might jump around a little bit, but so where we stand right now with this outbreak, this global outbreak, there are now in excess of 330,000 cases and over 14,000 deaths, worldwide. And last time I was on last week, the number was around 160,000 cases and 6,000 fatalities. And so the disease toll has again doubled in the space of a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's more people are testing for the virus now, especially in the U.S. So we're picking up, we're sort of just capturing and seeing what was already there. But I think that, these figures also show that this thing is growing exponentially, and it's sort of spreading from several major epicenters around the world. In the United States right now, we currently have something like 31,000 confirmed cases and 400 deaths, I think. But by the time people hear this, it'll probably, all of these figures will probably be quite a bit higher. We've been seeing quite, a daily jump by quite a bit, something like 30,000 new cases every day in the last, few days. In the U.S., though, we've had a particularly hard time rolling out wide-scale testing. And so until only very recently, we've been kind of flying blind in terms of getting an idea of the extent of this outbreak and how far it's traveled through our communities. For well over a month after our first case was confirmed here in the U.S., the CDC was the only entity allowed to administer the tests. And so there was this huge bottlenecking issue where there was all these people in line. There's a tiny number of laboratories who could carry out these tests. They've now finally just started to get this figured out and roll out wide scale testing. But at this point, I've already seen some experts saying that it's kind of too late, and that at this point, we've reached a phase of this outbreak that testing isn't really going to help us contain it anymore. That it's getting to the point where it's really hard to trace cases. There's community transmission to the point where testing just won't necessarily help us contain it. But some hospitals in certain areas, they're sort of preparing to shift to this triage model where they have to rank patients by their urgency and their prognosis and stuff. And some of those people simply we won't have resources to treat. And so, we've been seeing that kind of thing in Italy, and it seems like some of our hospitals, like in New York City, for example, they're starting to prepare to shift to that model. And unfortunately, the CDC and the FDA, they've both put a ton of obstacles in front of universities and commercial labs and state level labs, especially when it has to do with the test kits. There's been there's been some good reporting on this. You can find it at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and I think even Reason had a pretty good write-up just showing how the heaps of regulations have paralyzed our response to this pandemic. And so that's kind of frustrating to read. I think we can maybe leave some links in the show notes if people would also like to be frustrated at their government. I
was just gonna say one, great point that libertarian commenters like Dave Smith has been making is a lot of people are tweeting out the thing where you see there are no libertarians during the pandemic, and he's saying, look who screwed this thing up. If anything, it's further proof that the government can't do what we empower it to do. And very importantly, looking to take more power and more authority. I don't know if it was the episode I had you on last week, Will, but I talked about Will Arkin's article detailing the military's plans for martial law and potential takeover. Should they feel the need to do that during an epidemic or some kind of national emergency? And now today we had the Department of Justice sending a letter to Congress asking them to form legislation that will allow them to ask any high-ranking federal judge to allow them to imprison people for an indefinite amount of time during any kind of national emergency.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of like pretty like crazy alarming developments and like sort of going in both directions, like, stepping up like stringency and more and more strict laws and restrictions and stuff. But I've also seen certain other things, like in New York and Los Angeles, New York City, they've started freeing like nonviolent offenders from the prisons because the prisons are crowded. They're trying to like free up some room so there's not like because having all these people crammed in like sardines into this little dwelling, like that is risking a major outbreak, a really disastrous situation. So they've already started, releasing inmates in some of these major cities. And then I've also seen in Philadelphia, police have been ordered to stop arresting people for a list of crimes. Some of these I'm perfectly fine with, like narcotics crimes and prostitution and stuff, but also things like car theft and fraud and looting. They've been asked, like the police in Philadelphia have been told, like, don't arrest these people. Their policy, it's sort of like a catch and release thing where they detain them and take their information and get their identity. And then they're supposed to like let them go and send the paperwork to the detective division. And the plan is to go after them later. But, who knows how that's going to work out. And then, of course, along the same lines, you also had Portland saying that they're going to stop responding to anything that's not like a life-threatening situation. And so we've been seeing some breakdown of like police resources, or at least some reshuffling of how police are thinking about this. And then meanwhile, we've also seen 30 states have activated their National Guard units to do all kinds of things. Right now, I don't think they're policing the streets in any states. And the head of the National Guard, General Joseph Langyel, actually said that would not happen. There would be no policing. But I don't know, man. I don't know if that's, reliable. I mean, we saw what happened after Hurricane Katrina. You could see you can go and look up these pictures right now. The National Guard troops patrolling New Orleans with M16 slung around their shoulders. And at the same time, police were confiscating private firearms. And so I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen with this outbreak, but there is some precedent for those kind of things. So we are seeing some pretty alarming stuff happen with in terms of like law enforcement and prisons and things like that. Now, I guess just jumping around a little bit here, Rand Paul has tested positive for the coronavirus, and he's the first senator to come down with it. Fortunately, he says right now he's asymptomatic, so he's not he doesn't actually have like the disease. He just has the virus in his system, but he's not showing symptoms. But there's also a major risk, though, because he's been interacting with other senators and other lawmakers and their staff. And so there's some risk that he may have spread this to other lawmakers. And last week, we also had two congressmen. We had a Republican from Florida, Mario Diaz-Balart, who tested positive, and then also a guy, Ben McAdams from Utah, a Democrat. He's another congressman who's tested positive. So we have a couple lawmakers here. So that's kind of, interesting. And just, you could see that being a real problem, because there's certain rules within government, like they have to have a certain number of people present for a quorum to conduct any official business. Now, I think declaring a state of emergency, as the president has done, I think that might adjust the rules about what kind of quorum you have to have. But nonetheless, you could see in some scenarios this becoming a huge problem. Even if a lot of the people that remain asymptomatic, they'd still have to be quarantined. And so that could be, that could lead to some major paralysis within the legislature. And I guess just jumping around a little bit here, just in terms of updates, New York City has now become the largest epicenter in the United States. New York State itself, I think, actually could be considered that. They have 15,000 cases statewide, but 9,000 of those are in New York City alone. So that's pretty alarming, how a very crowded city where people are stacked really high, stacked on top of each other, where you have this outbreak. On Friday, the New York's governor, Andrew Cuomo, came out and ordered all non-essential businesses to shut down and basically gave a stay-at-home order. And there are some exceptions to that. People are allowed to, they can still travel somewhat for quite a few reasons. But it's getting more and more locked down in New York. And we may be headed toward, Italy or Spain level lockdowns. Hopefully not headed toward anything like what we saw in China's Hubei province, where, as we've talked about, off air a bit, that, people being welded into their apartment blocks and boarded up and sort of locked in. Really hope we're not heading toward anything like that. But we may be headed towards something similar to what we're seeing in Spain and Italy, where people are, heavily restricted and I think France now, too. They have to get permission to go out, and there are gendarmes patrolling. And California also issued a shelter in place order last week, along with Illinois and Connecticut and New Jersey. And so it's only been a small handful of states that have done that so far, but quite a few cities and smaller localities have have introduced like shelter-in-place orders, and we'll probably see that more and more in the coming weeks. We may end up in a situation where every state has issued restrictions like that, if not on a national level. I think the Trump administration has been kind of hesitant to, they've been saying, no, we're not going to do any lockdowns. But, this is a very rapidly evolving situation. And so I think those types of things can change. Just like the National Guard guy saying that we won't be policing the streets. I think that is also something that's, subject to change. So I don't know, just kind of jumping around. Those are some of the, I think, major updates this week with this pandemic, which really I think is like the biggest story on earth right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, I think at this point, there's enough going on that whether it's the virus itself or just the reaction to it, that it definitely is the biggest story, and it's going to have a major impact on us. Maybe one place I want to wrap up here, Will, is just talking about Rand Paul, and that a lot of people are once again trying to, kind of make fun of Ram for getting coronavirus, because had he been in the Senate, or maybe if he did, he's the kind of guy that would at the very least vote against corona bailout relief package, whatever the hell they want to call it, unless he could find offsetting costs for at least some of what they're planning on spending money on. And so people are like, aha, Rand gets coronavirus. And I just think that's such, a terrible attitude to have. But what I do think it represents kind of what happens. You have Donald Trump calling himself a wartime president when the nation is ready to go to war. That, even having a little bit of let's think about this rationally. Let's, at least make sure that we're being prudent in how much we're spending, and making sure we're trying to find that money somewhere. And we're not just going to, add $2 trillion to the budget or something absurd like that without really considering and looking at it, and just offering that small amount of criticism, or asking people to stop back and think. It gets Rand so heavily attacked. It's quite amazing. Also, I read that one of the reasons that Rand ended up getting tested was that he's considered to be at high risk, because he's still missing a piece of his lung from when his neighbor attacked him. Right. And so that was another situation where everybody was like, haha, Rand Paul gets attacked. And it's like, well, this is just a guy that's trying to, ask the government if we should be making these major steps based on a state of emotion and hysteria and fear, and not slow down and think about it, which is something I think we definitely miss time.
Right. I mean, and maybe, someone like Rand Paul might be a little less averse to a trillion or $2 trillion stimulus package if we didn't spend every other time, all the other time wasting constantly, maybe he'd be a little more willing to spend during an emergency if we weren't spending 24/7 all the time anyway, wasting. And so I don't think he's wrong to be concerned about waste, or also the impact to the economy this stuff might have, some of these measures and some of the stimulus, and what we've seen the Federal Reserve doing, cutting down interest rates and reintroducing quantitative easing, some of the things that got us in, that blew up the bubble we've been in for so long anyway, that we saw it deflate a little bit in 2008, but they never really let a whole realignment and correction happen. And so we've kind of just been blowing up. We're on the same trajectory, we're still in the same bubble. And they're just blowing it up even more and more and more now. And so it just kind of shows that okay, maybe I would have been more tolerant toward these emergency measures if you weren't always doing this stuff, other times. Now you've sort of blown your wad. I'm not sure how effective the stuff will be.
All right, Will, do you have anything else? If not, tell people where they can find your work.
Sure, yeah. No, I don't think I have anything else. I think we covered all the points we talked about. If people want to read what I write, they can check my Twitter handle at WKPANCAP. To see all the stuff I'm writing at RT and elsewhere. It's been a while since I've written for antiwar.com, but I've got a few in the viewpoint section there. The Libertarian Institute in the blog and the featured articles section. I've got quite a big archive at a site called the Daily Sheeple, and then a few at Consortium News as well.